On Father's Day, my daughter sent me a gift box. It was meant to be a surprise, but my wife, Jessica, saw it and immediately told me not to open it. I was confused and asked why she had that reaction. As I looked at the box more closely, I froze in shock. Just 10 minutes later, the police were at our door. What was inside was something I could have never imagined. I recalled my daughter's furious words about needing her money now, not after I was gone. The memory was so vivid that I could almost hear the coffee cup shattering on the hard wooden floor. Brown liquid spilled onto the Persian rug. My daughter, Samantha, had a flushed face and her manicured fingers trembled after dropping the cup. I tightened my grip on the inheritance documents I was holding. All my careful planning of the last 30 years had become a weapon in my daughter's desperate hands, and the papers crinkled under my knuckles, now white. I had told her I wasn't an ATM and explained that she would receive her inheritance when the time came. Peter, my son-in-law, had just sprawled deeper into the leather sofa with a widening smirk. He insisted that she was my only daughter and asked what a few $1,000s would mean to me, just to help them. I was appalled by his audacity. The man had no shame. Just last month, it had been his gambling debts. Before that, it had been Samantha's spending sprees. The requests for money never stopped, they only grew bolder. I repeated his words, "Help you out," as I stood up slowly, my 66-year-old joints aching with protest. I reminded them that I had been helping them out for 3 years straight and also made it clear that my retirement fund was not their personal bank. My wife, Jessica, had appeared in the doorway, a dish towel twisted in her hands. She had tried to calm everyone down and wanted us to talk about it reasonably. Samantha had then whirled toward her mother, incredulous at her suggestion. She said I was hoarding hundreds of thousands of dollars while they were drowning in debt. I had quietly reminded her that the debt was of her own making, from her own choices. The family photo on the mantelpiece was now face down. I wasn't sure if it had fallen during her outburst or if she had intentionally turned it away. The silver frame reflected the overhead light like a mirror, showing nothing but empty brightness. Peter had leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. He told me I was getting old and wanted me to share my wealth while I was alive to see it appreciated. The disrespect in being called old man tasted bitter in my mouth. This was coming from someone who had never held a steady job and lived off my daughter's credit cards and my occasional generosity, while I had worked for 43 years for that money. Each word I spoke came out harder than the one before. 43 years of 12-hour days, missed dinners, and cancelled vacations. I had done it all so Samantha could have a comfortable childhood and so her mother and I could retire with dignity. She had then scoffed at the word dignity and laughed harshly. She asked what was dignified about hoarding money while her daughter suffered. I had scoffed at the word suffers. I looked at her designer handbag, her fresh highlights, her expensive jewelry, and Peter's brand new sneakers. Their suffering looked remarkably comfortable. I told her that her suffering was self-inflicted. The words came out before I could stop them. I said every crisis, every emergency, and every desperate plea for money was a situation she had created herself. The silence that followed was as tight as piano wire. Jessica fully entered the room, her face pale. She whispered my name, William. Samantha's voice cracked like breaking glass as she asked what we should do. I believe she thought we would continue to enable her selfishness or that we would continue to pretend I was a loving father instead of a greedy miser. Her accusations felt like physical blows. She called me greedy, selfish, and unloving. 43 years of sacrifice and this was the reward I was getting. Peter stood up, his expression becoming uglier. He told me what he thought, that I enjoyed watching them struggle and that it made me feel powerful. I told them to get out. The words came from deep within my chest. I told them both to get out of my house. Samantha questioned if it was my house. Her eyes glittered dangerously. She reminded me that her mom had helped to pay for the house, and she also told me she had grown up in it. She believed I couldn't just kick out my own daughter. I told her to watch me. But she didn't move. Neither did Peter. They stood there like predators who had sensed weakness, waiting for me to back down, waiting for the usual apology, the usual compromise, and the usual check to buy temporary peace. Not this time, I decided. I walked to the front door and opened it wide. Cool evening air rushed in, carrying the scent of honeysuckle and the distant sound of a neighbor's laughter. Normal families having normal conversations. I wondered how long it had been since we had all laughed together. I spoke to Samantha without turning around. I told her to take her husband and leave. I also said that they shouldn't come back until they were ready to have a respectful conversation about their financial problems and solutions that didn't involve my wallet. As she grabbed her purse, she hissed that I would regret this. She warned me that when I was old and sick and needed someone to take care of me, I would remember this moment and that I had chosen money over family. The sound of her heels clicking across the hardwood floor sounded like gunshots. Peter followed her, pausing at the threshold. He muttered to me that this wasn't over. He then told me that family doesn't abandon family. The door slammed so hard it rattled the windows. The silence that followed felt heavier than their shouting. I stood frozen at the front door, my hands still gripping the brass handle. Through the decorative glass panels, I watched Samantha's BMW reverse aggressively out of our driveway, its tires spinning on the asphalt. I felt Jessica's soft footsteps behind me. She called my name. I turned slowly to face her. The living room looked like a battlefield. Coffee stains darkened the Persian rug we had bought for our 20th anniversary. Inheritance documents were scattered across the hardwood floor like fallen leaves. The overturned family photo caught the lamplight, its silver frame winking mockingly. I whispered, 43 years, to myself. She asked what I had said. I reminded her that for 43 years I had worked overtime shifts during her high school years so she could have new clothes, college textbooks, and that car for her 16th birthday. My voice caught as I mentioned the wedding we couldn't afford but paid for anyway. Jessica picked up the scattered papers with careful and deliberate movements. She had said that Samantha was struggling. I replied that the gambling problem was her choice. My words came out sharper than I had intended. I said every casino visit, every online bet, and every lie about where the money went was her choice. I walked to the mantelpiece and righted the family photo. A 5-year-old gap-toothed and innocent Samantha smiled back at me from the photo, sitting on my shoulders at the county fair. I wondered when that joyful child had become this manipulative stranger, demanding my life savings. I then asked Jessica if she remembered when Samantha had wanted that dollhouse for Christmas. I said this while touching the glass of the photo. It was the one from the expensive toy store downtown, and I had worked double shifts for 2 months to afford it. Jessica's silence was answer enough. We both remembered, just as we remembered the ballet lessons, the summer camps, and the brand-name shoes because her friends all had them. Every sacrifice was made gladly for our daughter's happiness. And now she throws coffee mugs at me because I wouldn't hand over my retirement fund. Jessica told me that she didn't throw it at me, she had thrown it at the floor. The distinction felt meaningless. The violence and disrespect were the same, whether aimed at me or my possessions. I bent down and picked up one of the inheritance documents. The legal language blurred as I read it, but I knew every clause by heart. It was years of careful planning, conservative investments, and delayed gratification. All so Samantha would be financially secure after we were gone. Jessica had quietly mentioned Peter's influence. She said he filled Samantha's head with ideas about what we owed her. I said Peter didn't create her greed, he just gave her greed permission to show itself. The harsh truth hung between us. Our daughter had become someone we barely recognized, and we had enabled it by always giving in, always writing the check, and always smoothing over her latest crisis with our money. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number, but I immediately recognized the writing style. The message said, "Dad, I hope you're happy." It went on to say that kids needed winter coats and school supplies, but apparently my precious money was more important than my grandchildren. The message concluded by warning me not to expect to see them anytime soon. My grandchildren were the ultimate weapon in Samantha's arsenal. Emma and Jake were 8 and 6 years old. They were innocent casualties in their mother's war for my wallet. She knew exactly where to strike to cause the most pain. I showed Jessica the message. Her face crumpled. She asked if Samantha would really keep them away from us. But we both knew that she would. She had done it before during smaller arguments. A week here, 2 weeks there, whenever we didn't immediately comply with her financial demands, she used the children as bargaining chips in her endless quest for money. Jessica suggested that maybe we should reconsider. I said no. The word came out like a gunshot. I was not going to do this anymore. I wouldn't be held hostage by threats about the grandchildren. I wouldn't teach Emma and Jake that love could be bought, or that family relationships were just transactions. Jessica flinched at my vehemence. In 38 years of marriage, she had rarely seen me this angry. Even during our worst arguments, I had never spoken with such cold finality. But something had shifted that night. I had a fundamental new understanding about my daughter, our relationship, and the future I had imagined for our family. The illusion of loving sacrifice had shattered as completely as that coffee mug. My phone buzzed again. 6 days later, I was sitting on our front porch with the Sunday paper, trying to find some normalcy in the Father's Day morning routine. The coffee in my mug had grown cold, but I held on to it anyway, watching neighbors emerge for their weekend activities. The Hendersons were loading their car for what looked like a family outing. The Patels were working in their garden, their laughter carrying across the quiet suburban street. Jessica was moving around inside the kitchen, and the soft clatter of breakfast dishes drifted through the open window. We had spent the week in careful conversation, dancing around the Samantha-shaped hole in our family dynamic. Neither of us had heard from her since that night. No calls, no texts, and no surprise visits demanding money or reconciliation. The silence felt unnatural. In 3 years of financial crisis, Samantha had never gone this long without contact. Usually, by day 3, she would be calling with apologies and smaller requests, testing the waters before launching into her next major plea for money. But this was different. The completeness of the silence felt deliberate and calculated, almost like the calm before a storm. Part of me felt relieved. Part of me worried. The rumble of a delivery truck broke through my thoughts. I looked up from the sports section to see a brown UPS vehicle slowing in front of our house. It was strange because we weren't expecting anything, and Sunday deliveries were rare unless someone paid extra for the service. The driver hopped out, consulted his handheld device, and then grabbed a medium-sized box from the back. He approached with the professional efficiency of someone working holiday overtime. "William Carr," he said, and I replied, "That's me." The driver then said, "Happy Father's Day," while offering me the package and his electronic clipboard. I signed my name, studying the shipping label as he walked away. There was no return address visible, just generic shipping information. The box was surprisingly light for its size. It was about the dimensions of a shoebox but weighed maybe 2 pounds at most. "Who is it from?" Jessica called from the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. I replied that I had no idea. I carried the package inside, setting it on the coffee table where the inheritance documents had been scattered just 6 days earlier. She approached with a curious but cautious expression, noticing the lack of a return address. Jessica had always been more suspicious of unexpected deliveries than I was, with too many years of hearing about package bombs and mail fraud on the evening news. She suggested it might be from the grandchildren, but her tone lacked conviction. Emma had asked about Father's Day when we saw them last month, before Samantha had weaponized them against us with threats and ultimatums. I pushed those thoughts away. I agreed that it could be from them, although something felt off. The timing seemed too convenient and calculated, and I knew Emma would not have paid for special Sunday delivery. Jessica leaned closer, examining the box with the same methodical attention she brought to everything from grocery shopping to crossword puzzles. Her fingers traced the edges of the shipping label. She then said my name slowly, William. She told me not to open it. I asked why. She pointed to something I had completely missed in my casual handling of the box. She asked if I could see the holes. She said they were for breathing, which meant something alive was inside. My stomach dropped. Now that she had pointed them out, I could see tiny punctures in the cardboard that were barely visible unless you knew to look. They were small, precise holes that someone had clearly made on purpose. I repeated the words, breathing holes, my voice flat. Something's alive in there, Jessica confirmed, backing away from the coffee table. She wondered what it was. We just stood there in our living room, staring at the innocent-looking package as if it might suddenly sprout legs and run away. The morning sunlight streaming through our windows seemed less warm now, and the suburban quiet felt more ominous. Who would send us something alive? Jessica whispered. But even as she asked the question, I felt a cold certainty settling in my chest. The timing, the anonymous sender, the Sunday delivery that ensured we would be home and unsuspecting. This was not a gift. This was something else entirely. From inside the box came the faintest sound, a soft rustling that made us both freeze. The sound stopped as quickly as it had started, leaving an intense silence. Jessica grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging into my skin through the cotton of my polo shirt. She breathed, "Did you hear that?" I nodded, unable to trust my voice. Whatever was in that box was very much alive, and it was waking up. A soft hissing sound emerged from the cardboard, barely audible, but unmistakably real. We both froze, staring at the package as if it might explode at any moment. The sound stopped. Silence stretched between us like a held breath. Then it came again, longer this time. A distinct hiss that sent ice through my veins. Jessica's grip on my arm tightened until her nails bit through the fabric of my shirt. She whispered, "William," her voice barely a breath. "Call someone now," she told me. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone. Muscle memory took over while my mind struggled to process what we were facing. The numbers felt foreign under my trembling fingers. I heard the dispatcher on the other line say, "What's your emergency?" I quickly told them we had a suspicious package with something alive inside. The words tumbled out faster than I had intended. I explained it had been delivered that morning with no return address and was making sounds. The dispatcher asked me to describe the sounds I was hearing. I glanced at Jessica, who nodded encouragingly. The hissing had stopped again, but we both knew it would return. I repeated the word, hissing, but I couldn't finish the sentence. I was thinking, like a snake, but the thought felt too dangerous to say aloud. The dispatcher then asked if there were any visible threats or damage to the package. There was no visible damage, but I mentioned the small holes punched in the cardboard. "Breathing holes," I said. My voice cracked on the last words. The dispatcher said officers were being dispatched to our location immediately. They warned us to maintain a safe distance and not to open it. They then asked if we could move to another room. I replied that we were about 6 feet away in our living room. I asked if we should leave the house. The dispatcher told us to stay inside but keep our distance. Officers would arrive within 10 minutes. We were told not to touch or move the package under any circumstances. The line went quiet except for the sound of the dispatcher's typing. 10 minutes felt like an eternity with something dangerous sitting on our coffee table, growing more active with each passing moment. Once I had hung up, Jessica asked me who could have done this. It was the question I had been dreading. The answer felt obvious, but saying it out loud would make it real. It would be an acknowledgement that our daughter had crossed a line I had never imagined possible. I admitted that I was afraid to guess. But my mind was already there, connecting the dots I didn't want to see. The timing on Father's Day wasn't coincidental. The anonymous sender knew our address, our schedules, and our vulnerabilities. Someone was angry enough about our recent argument to plan something this elaborate and cruel. Another sound from the box made us both step backward, not just hissing this time, but a rustling that suggested movement, something shifting position inside the confined space. Jessica quietly mentioned the argument from 6 days ago. She said Samantha was so angry when she left. She didn't need to say Samantha's name. We were both thinking it. We were both arriving at the same horrible conclusion through different paths of logic and dread. I gestured at the package and said this was different. This wasn't anger, this was something else. The word revenge hung unspoken between us. It was too ugly to voice but impossible to ignore. Our daughter, the child we had raised, supported, and loved despite her flaws, had sent us something designed to frighten or harm us. The box rustled again, more insistently this time. Whatever was inside was definitely awake now, probably confused by its surroundings and possibly agitated by our voices and movement. What kind of person does this to their own parents? Jessica's voice broke on the question. I said someone desperate, although the words felt inadequate. I said someone who thinks they've been wronged. But deep down, I knew it was more than desperation. This required planning, calculation, and a level of malice that spoke to something broken in the relationship between a parent and child. Samantha hadn't just lashed out in anger, she had crafted a deliberate act of psychological warfare. The sound of car doors slamming outside made us both jump. Through the front window, I could see a police cruiser in our driveway. 2 officers walked toward our door with the purposeful stride of people trained to handle dangerous situations. Relief flooded through me so quickly it made my knees weak. Professional help had arrived. Soon, whatever nightmare lurked in that innocent-looking package would be someone else's responsibility to handle safely. The doorbell rang, sharp and authoritative, in the tense quiet of our home. I opened the door before Officer Todd Reeves could knock a second time. His presence filled the door frame. He was tall and solidly built with the practiced alertness of someone who had handled domestic emergencies. The nameplate on his uniform read T. Reeves. He introduced himself as Officer Reeves and told me they had received our call about a suspicious package. I thanked him for coming so quickly and stepped aside to let him enter. I told him it was in the living room. He wiped his boots on our welcome mat before crossing the threshold. Jessica appeared in the hallway, still wearing her apron with her hands twisted nervously. She told the officer how grateful we were that he was there and said we didn't know what else to do. He calmly reassured her that we had done exactly the right thing. His voice carried calm authority. He asked us to show him the package. We led him to the living room where the box sat on our coffee table, looking smaller now that professional help had arrived. Officer Reeves approached carefully, pulling latex gloves from his utility belt. He asked when it arrived. I said about 35 minutes ago. I told him it was Sunday delivery and that someone paid extra for the service. He examined the shipping label without touching the box. He noted that there was no return address visible. He then asked if we had heard sounds coming from inside. Jessica quietly said, hissing. She couldn't finish her thought. Officer Reeves matter-of-factly completed her thought, saying, like a snake. He said he had handled similar situations before and that it was usually non-venomous, but they took every precaution. He then reached for his radio. He said he was calling Animal Control, who had the proper equipment for safe removal. The radio crackled with a confirmation. The dispatcher said it would take 20 minutes for Animal Control to respond. Officer Reeves turned back to us, his tone shifting from professional to curious. He wanted to know if we had any idea who might have sent this. It was the question I had been dreading. I could feel Jessica's eyes on me, waiting to see how I would respond. I carefully said that I didn't know and it was probably just some kids playing pranks. His gaze sharpened slightly. He said that kids would need access to live animals, shipping materials, and knowledge of our address. He said this required planning and resources. My mouth went dry. He was right. Someone with the means and motive had deliberately sent us a snake on Father's Day. He then asked us if we had had any recent conflicts or family disagreements. The phrase hung in the air like an accusation. Jessica tensed beside me, and we were both walking a tightrope between honesty and loyalty. I managed to say that there was nothing that would lead to this. Officer Reeves studied my face, noticing my hesitation, but he didn't push. Instead, he pulled out a small notebook. He asked if there had been any unusual charges on our credit cards recently, like from pet stores or exotic animal suppliers. The question hit me like a physical blow. The memory crashed over me with terrible clarity, that charge I had noticed on last month's statement. Samantha used my credit card for emergencies. The charge was for Reptile Palace. I had just assumed it was for the grandchildren. Not for a snake. Never for a snake. Officer Reeves asked me if I was all right. I forced my expression back to neutral, although my heart hammered against my ribs. I said I was fine and that I was just processing all this. But I wasn't fine. The puzzle pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity, the timing, the knowledge of our routines, the access to my credit card, and the deliberate cruelty of choosing Father's Day. My daughter had sent me a snake. Officer Reeves asked if I would be filing a formal report. He said they could investigate the package's origin and pursue charges if they identified the sender. I looked at Jessica, and I saw the same conflict behind her eyes. Part of me wanted justice, but the larger part, the part that had spent 34 years protecting Samantha despite her flaws, couldn't turn her over to the police. I quietly said no and that I didn't want to make a mountain out of a molehill. If it was just a prank, I felt that filing charges seemed excessive. Officer Reeves made a note, although his expression suggested he had heard this response before, family loyalty trumping justice, even when family members crossed dangerous lines. Another vehicle pulled into our driveway. Through the window, I could see a white van with Animal Control Services painted on the side. Officer Reeves said that would be Mike Johnson. He said Mike was the best wildlife specialist in the county and that he would have it resolved safely within the hour. But as I watched the animal control officer grab his equipment, I knew the real situation was just beginning. Mike Johnson worked with the methodical efficiency of someone who had handled stranger situations than ours. Within 20 minutes, he had safely extracted a 3-foot corn snake from the shipping box, confirmed it was non-venomous, and loaded it into a secure carrier for transport to a local reptile rescue. He said it was a beautiful specimen and that someone had paid good money for it. He added that corn snakes make excellent pets when properly cared for and that it was a shame someone used it for whatever this was. Officer Reeves shook hands with both of us before departing. He told me to call him if I remembered anything else about possible senders and said that even pranks like this could escalate if left unchecked. I nodded, maintaining the facade of cooperation while my mind churned with darker possibilities. Both vehicles disappeared down our quiet suburban street, leaving Jessica and me alone with the morning's aftermath. The living room felt different now, violated somehow, despite the professional cleanup. The coffee table bore faint water stains where Mike had disinfected the surface. The scattered inheritance documents had been res-tacked neatly, but their symbolic power had shifted. They were no longer tools of family planning but evidence of the betrayal that had triggered this morning's events. Jessica busied herself in the kitchen, running water in the sink with unnecessary vigor. Stress cleaning was her standard response to family crises. I stood at the front window, watching the Hendersons return from their Father's Day outing. Their car was loaded with picnic gear and children's laughter. Normal families, normal Sunday mornings, normal fathers who didn't receive venomous surprises from their daughters. The credit card charge burned in my memory like a brand, Reptile Palace $127. 50-inch from 3 weeks ago, right after our argument about the inheritance. It was perfect timing for planning revenge. My phone felt heavy in my hands as I scrolled to Samantha's contact information. Her smiling photo looked back at me. It was a picture from Emma's birthday party last year, before the financial demands had escalated, before the threats about access to the grandchildren, before this morning's snake delivery. "Are you really going to call her?" Jessica quietly asked from the kitchen doorway. I told her I needed to know for certain. I then wondered what I would do if my suspicions were confirmed. What action could a father take against a daughter who had crossed such a fundamental line? I didn't have an answer yet, but I knew the conversation was necessary. The phone rang twice before she picked up. Her voice had an artificial brightness, the tone she used when she wanted something or was hiding something. She asked me how my father's day was going. My grip tightened on the phone. If she was innocent, the question was natural. If she was guilty, it was cruel mockery. I kept my voice neutral and conversational, saying it had been an interesting morning, and then asked her if she knew anything about a strange Father's Day gift. Her response came quickly, almost too quickly. She said, "No, Dad." What happened? But what happened next was what confirmed my worst suspicions. In the background, unmistakably, I heard Peter's quiet laughter. It wasn't the surprised chuckle of someone hearing unexpected news but the satisfied snicker of someone who thought they had gotten away with something clever. The sound hit me like a physical blow. All doubt vanished in that moment of careless amusement. My daughter had sent me a snake, and her husband found it entertaining. Just some confusion with the delivery, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. Nothing important. I should let you go. She asked if I was sure everything was okay because I sounded strange. I was discovering that my only daughter had tried to terrorize me with a live reptile, and she thought I sounded strange. Everything's fine, Samantha. Enjoy your Sunday, I said. I ended the call before she could respond, before my carefully maintained composure could crack completely. The phone trembled in my hands as the full weight of the betrayal settled over me. Jessica appeared at my side, reading my face with the intuition of 38 years of marriage. She asked if I had heard something. I said Peter had laughed in the background. When she had asked what happened, he had laughed like it was the funniest joke he had ever heard. Jessica's hand found my arm, a steadying presence in the shifting landscape of our family dynamics. She asked me what I was going to do. I looked down at the phone, then toward my home office, where the computer held access to bank accounts, credit cards, and all the financial tools that had kept Samantha afloat for 3 years straight. I was going to teach my daughter about consequences. By 7 o'clock that evening, I was sitting in my home office with the door closed and the computer humming quietly in the evening stillness. I had spent the afternoon in careful thought, walking through our neighborhood and reviewing 30 years of financial decisions that had brought us to this moment. The anger had settled into something colder and more purposeful. My desk held the accumulated evidence of a father's generosity. Bank statements showed monthly transfers to cover Samantha's rent. There were credit card bills I had paid without question. Insurance premiums, car payments, and emergency loans were never repaid, 3 decades of enabling disguised as love. The leather portfolio beside my keyboard contained documents I had reviewed dozens of times, copies of checks written for her wedding, receipts from the car I had sold to pay her gambling debts, and bank transfers labeled emergency assistance that had become monthly obligations. Each piece of paper told the same story of a daughter who had learned to see her father as an endless source of money rather than guidance. The computer screen glowed as I navigated to our online banking portal. My fingers moved steadily across the keyboard, typing the familiar passwords I had never shared with Samantha, although she had managed to access plenty without them. First, I addressed the credit card account, the same one that showed the Reptile Palace charge from 3 weeks ago. Samantha was an authorized user, a status I had granted her during college for emergencies. 20-year-old emergencies had multiplied into a permanent lifestyle. I clicked on Manage Users. The system prompted me with security questions. My mother's maiden name and the street where I grew up were simple answers that unlocked access to tools I should have used years ago. The screen asked in neutral blue text to remove authorized user. My cursor hovered over confirm for perhaps 10 seconds, not from hesitation, but from the profound shift I felt occurring within myself. For 30 years, I had funded her irresponsibility, and now, I had decided it was enough. I clicked. The user access was revoked. The changes would take effect within 1 business hour. Next came the PIN changes. Samantha had somehow learned the numbers, probably watching over my shoulder during one of our many financial rescue missions. I selected new digits, the year Jessica and I were married. These were numbers that meant something to our relationship but nothing to our daughter's schemes. The automated payments required more attention. Monthly transfers to her checking account, the recurring payment for her car insurance, a subscription service for her gym membership that she had convinced me was essential for her mental health. Each cancellation required confirmation, a digital paper trail of my decision to stop being her private bank. My hands remained steady throughout the process. There was no trembling and no hesitation. This was not cruelty, it was overdue accountability. I remembered the conversation last month when she had called, sobbing about the gambling debts and how she had promised this was the last time, the final crisis I would need to solve. I had believed her, transferred another $5,000, and told Jessica we were helping our daughter learn responsibility. Instead, I had been teaching her that consequences were optional. The final screen showed a summary of the changes. Credit access was removed, automatic payments were cancelled, and PIN codes were updated. The work of 30 years of enabling was undone in 30 minutes of methodical clicking. I clicked Save. The confirmation appeared instantly. Account changes processed. Updated information will be available immediately. Leaning back in my leather desk chair, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years when it came to Samantha: control. It wasn't the desperate, reactive scrambling to fix her latest crisis but the calm authority of a parent who had finally remembered that love sometimes requires saying no. Tomorrow morning, she would discover that her financial safety net had been removed. Her credit card would be declined. Her automatic payments would bounce. Her assumed access to my resources would simply end. For the first time in decades, the consequences of her choices would be entirely her own responsibility. The phone on my desk remained silent, but I knew that wouldn't last long. Morning arrived with unusual peace. I sat at our kitchen table with my coffee and the newspaper, watching sunlight filter through Jessica's herb garden on the windowsill. For the first time in years, I felt no anxiety about potential financial emergencies, no dread of manipulative phone calls. Jessica moved quietly around the kitchen, refilling my coffee cup with the comfortable efficiency of 38 years of shared mornings. She hadn't asked any questions about my evening in the office, but her slight smile suggested she understood perfectly what I had accomplished. The phone rang at 8:15. Samantha's name appeared on the caller ID, exactly as expected. I let it ring twice more before answering, using those extra seconds to center myself. I answered, "Good morning, Samantha." She responded with a voice shrill with panic, "Dad, what have you done? My card isn't working. I tried to buy groceries, and it was declined. The automatic payment for my car insurance bounced. What is happening?" I took a sip of coffee before responding. "Samantha, I know you sent me that Father's Day gift." The silence stretched for several heartbeats. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted from panic to defensive fury. "You've lost your mind. How could you set me up like this?" she said. She wasn't asking what I was talking about or what Father's Day gift I was referring to. The woman who had sent me a snake was now accusing me of setting traps. Her reaction told me everything I needed to know. I calmly said that I didn't do anything, I simply stopped paying for her irresponsibility. She said I was insane and couldn't just cut her off without warning. She said she had bills, obligations, and responsibilities. I let the word responsibilities hang between us. I was thinking of her responsibilities, like treating her parents with basic respect and handling her own finances instead of depending on mine. Jessica had stopped her morning routine to watch my face, reading my expressions for signs of stress. But I felt remarkably calm, almost detached from Samantha's hysteria. She then started to plead. "Dad, please, you don't understand. Peter and I are struggling right now. The apartment rent is due and my car payment." I cut her off. I reminded her of her car payment that I had been making for 2 years, and the apartment rent that came out of my account every month. I said perhaps it was time she understood what actual financial responsibility looked like. She then said, "Fine. You want to play games?" Her voice rose to a pitch that would have concerned me yesterday. "Don't expect to see your grandchildren anytime soon. Emma and Jake won't even remember you by the time." I cut her off with quiet firmness and said that those threats had stopped working yesterday morning. The phone went silent except for her rapid breathing. I could almost hear her recalibrating, searching for the manipulation tactic that had always worked before. She then switched to a victim voice, which had opened my wallet countless times. She whispered, "I can't believe you're doing this to me. I'm your daughter. I'm struggling. And instead of helping me, you're punishing me for something I didn't even do." I was thinking, something she didn't even do. There was still no direct denial, no confusion about what gift I had referenced, just the blanket deflection of someone who knew exactly what she had done and was angry about facing consequences. I told her that her struggle was not my responsibility. I said her choices had created her situation. Her choices had sent that package. And her choices will determine what happens next. She then said I was being ridiculous. She called it one little prank and said I was completely losing my mind. One little prank. There it was. Not quite a confession, but close enough to confirm what her panicked overreaction had already revealed. She had sent me a live snake as a little prank and now expected me to continue funding her lifestyle. I told her that a prank involving a dangerous animal was not little. And a father cutting off financial support after 30 years of enabling was not losing his mind, it was finally finding it. Her voice turned arctic. "This isn't over, old man. You think you can control me by controlling money? We'll see about that." The line went dead. I set the phone down gently and looked at Jessica, who had watched the entire conversation with growing admiration. The morning sunlight still streamed through her herbs, and the coffee still tasted perfect. Jessica said quietly that Samantha was coming here. I nodded and said she probably was with Peter, and they would want to continue this conversation in person. She then asked if I was ready for that. I thought about the question seriously. Was I ready for my daughter to arrive at our home with her unemployed husband, demanding access to money she had never earned, threatening grandchildren she had already weaponized? "Yes," I said. "I think I am." The sound of a car engine roaring into our driveway shattered the morning calm. Tires squealed against the asphalt as the vehicle stopped abruptly, followed by the sharp slam of two car doors. Jessica and I exchanged a glance. We both knew who had arrived. Heavy footsteps marched across our front walkway with a determined rhythm. The doorbell rang once, sharp and demanding, then immediately again when no one answered fast enough. I stood slowly, feeling remarkably calm despite the approaching storm. I quietly told Jessica to stay there. She replied with unexpected strength that we were in this together. The doorbell gave way to aggressive knocking. I walked to the front entrance and opened it to find Samantha and Peter standing on our porch like a two-person army ready for battle. Samantha's face was flushed red with anger, her hair disheveled as if she had dressed hastily and driven here in a fury. Peter loomed behind her, his expression dark with a malice I had never seen directed at me before. Samantha said, "Dad, we need to talk." I remained in the doorway, not inviting them inside. I said we had already talked that morning, and I thought I was quite clear. She laughed harshly and said I was insane. She said I couldn't just cut her off because of some ridiculous misunderstanding about a Father's Day package. Even now, standing on my doorstep demanding money, she couldn't bring herself to admit what she had done. I told her there was no misunderstanding. I said she had sent me a snake and I had responded appropriately. Peter stepped forward, his bulk filling more of the doorway. He said I probably hadn't thought this through properly and that Samantha had expenses and responsibilities, and kids needed things. I replied evenly that those kids had a mother who threatened to keep them away from their grandparents when she didn't get money. Samantha's face contorted with desperate fury. She said, "Fine. You want to play hardball? You'll never see your grandchildren again. Emma and Jake will grow up knowing their grandfather chose money over family." The words that had once been my greatest fear now felt powerless against the clarity I had gained. I looked at my daughter and saw not the child I had raised but the manipulative stranger she had become. I quietly told her that was not a threat, it was a blessing. The shock on her face was complete. This was not the response she had expected. It was not the devastating blow that had always brought me to my knees before. Peter's mouth fell open. Samantha stammered, "You, what?" I told her that if she was the kind of person who used children as weapons against their grandparents, then perhaps it was better that they were not exposed to that kind of manipulation while they were young. Peter's expression shifted to something darker. He stepped forward, close enough that I could smell the anger radiating from him. He said he and Samantha knew where I lived and my routines and suggested that I might want to reconsider my position. I felt Jessica tense behind me, but I remained perfectly still. I asked Peter if he was threatening me. He said he was just saying that family relationships worked both ways. He then said I wanted to cut them off, and that was fine, but I shouldn't expect them to disappear quietly. I said that was exactly what I expected, and if they chose not to, it would become a matter for the police rather than family negotiation. Samantha grabbed his arm, perhaps sensing he was pushing into territory that could have legal consequences, but her touch didn't calm him. It seemed to fuel his aggression. He then said I thought I was so smart and that cutting off their money made me powerful. He said there were other ways to get what they needed. I agreed and suggested novel concepts like getting jobs, because people had been supporting themselves through employment for centuries. Samantha then hissed that it wasn't over. Her desperation transformed into pure venom. She said I would regret treating them like this, that family doesn't abandon family, and there would be consequences. I replied that there already were consequences and they were living them right then. They stared at me for a long moment, perhaps finally understanding that no amount of threats, guilt, or manipulation was going to restore their access to my resources. The man who had spent 30 years being their personal bank had simply closed. Without another word, Samantha spun on her heel and stalked back to their car. Peter followed, but not before giving me one last menacing look. I watched them drive away, their car engine revving unnecessarily loud. Only when their taillights disappeared did I close the front door and turn to Jessica. Her face was pale, but her eyes held something I hadn't seen in years, pride. I said we were going to need legal advice. Evening brought the quiet normalcy that had become precious in our house. Jessica and I sat at our kitchen table after dinner, the domestic routine providing comfort after the morning's chaos. She sipped chamomile tea while I nursed my second cup of coffee. We were both processing the day's events. The kitchen had always been our sanctuary for serious conversations. It was here we had discussed buying the house, planned for retirement, and talked through concerns about Samantha's early struggles with money. Now it served as the place where we contemplated the complete breakdown of our family relationship. Jessica quietly said that she kept thinking about when Samantha was 8 and asked if I remembered the Mother's Day breakfast she had made, which had been burned toast and orange juice with too much pulp. But she had been so proud. I did remember Samantha in her pink pajamas standing on a kitchen stool to reach the counter, determined to surprise us with breakfast in bed. The memory felt like it belonged to someone else's family now. I said that she used to draw us pictures, stick figures of our family holding hands, and I had kept them in my office desk drawer for years. Jessica's voice carried maternal grief as she told me she still had some in that memory box upstairs. She said that Samantha was still our daughter despite everything that had happened that day. It was the moment I had been expecting all day. Jessica's instinct was to heal, to find middle ground, and to somehow restore what had been broken. It was one of the qualities I had fallen in love with, this unwavering belief that families could overcome anything. I gently told her that Samantha had crossed a line, and I had one more step to take. Her teacup paused halfway to her lips. She asked what kind of step I was going to take. I looked at my wife's face, seeing her concern and her hope that whatever I was planning might somehow bring our daughter back instead of pushing her further away. How could I explain that bringing her back was no longer the goal? I said I needed to do something permanent that would ensure that morning scene never happened again. She didn't question my intent. She knew me well enough to understand that legal protection was the only solution left. I confirmed that I was talking about changing the will. She was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with the implications. Changing our estate planning would be more than a financial decision. It would be a formal acknowledgement that our daughter was no longer trustworthy. She finally brought up the grandchildren, Emma and Jake, and I replied that they would be better off not learning that love could be purchased with money. I reached across the table and took her hand. I told her that what she had done that day wasn't desperation, it was calculated cruelty. The snake, the threats, and the manipulation were what she had chosen to become. I said that if we cut her out completely, we would protect ourselves from future abuse, we would protect our marriage from constantly managing her crisis, and we would protect our retirement from being slowly drained away by someone who saw us as a resource rather than as parents. Jessica squeezed my hand, her thumb tracing across my knuckles in the gesture that had comforted me through decades of smaller challenges. I knew this wasn't a smaller challenge, though. This was the end of something fundamental. She asked if it would stop her and if she would finally leave us alone if I changed everything legally. I replied that it would remove her incentive for contact. No access to money, no inheritance to protect, and no leverage to maintain. She would have to find other people to manipulate. The pragmatism of it felt cold but necessary. Samantha would move on to easier targets, people who hadn't yet learned to recognize her patterns. Jessica whispered that she hated that it had come to this. I agreed, but I said that I wouldn't spend our remaining years being held hostage by threats and manipulation, and that I wouldn't let her destroy what we had built together. Outside our kitchen window, the suburban evening continued its peaceful rhythm. The Hendersons were walking their dog, and Mrs. Patterson was watering her garden. Normal people living normal lives. Jessica asked when I would do it, and I replied, tomorrow morning. I said I would call Margaret Summers first thing. She had handled our legal work for 15 years and would know exactly what needed to be done to make it ironclad. Jessica nodded slowly, accepting the inevitable, even as it broke her heart. And if Samantha finds out, she eventually will, but by then the legal protections will be in place. Her anger won't be able to touch us anymore. I stood up from the table, carrying our empty cups to the sink. Behind me, I heard Jessica's quiet sigh, not of disagreement but of grief for the daughter we had lost. Tomorrow, I would take that final step. Tonight, I would hold my wife and let her mourn the family we had thought we were. Margaret Summers's law office occupied the third floor of a granite building downtown, its walls lined with legal volumes that spoke of 15 years of protecting families like ours. I sat across from her mahogany desk with a manila folder of documents, feeling calmer than I had in weeks. She removed her reading glasses and said that when I had called that morning, I had mentioned needing comprehensive legal protection, and she asked me to tell her what had been happening. Margaret had handled our wills, property transfers, and Jessica's mother's estate. She knew us as the stable couple who planned ahead and paid bills promptly. What I was about to describe would sound like a different family entirely. I explained the inheritance argument, the snake delivery, the blocked credit cards, and the threatening confrontation. Margaret listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, her expression growing more serious with each detail. I concluded by saying that Peter had said they knew where we lived and our routines, and it felt like a direct threat. She set down her pen and leaned back. She said this went beyond a family disagreement and that I was describing harassment and intimidation. She said we needed to address this on multiple fronts. That was what I had hoped she would say. Margaret pulled out a fresh legal pad. She said to start with my will and that I had mentioned wanting to restructure my inheritance. I said I wanted my money to go to my grandchildren's education, not to my daughter's casino. She said that was a wise decision and that we could create an educational trust fund that would provide for Emma and Jake's schooling, college expenses, and legitimate educational needs while preventing any access by their parents. She outlined the framework. An independent trustee would manage the funds, releasing money only for documented educational expenses. Samantha and Peter would have no access, no control, and no ability to manipulate the children's inheritance. I asked about Jessica. Margaret said she would be fully protected, of course, and that the house, our retirement accounts, and her security would not change. This would only affect what would have gone to Samantha. Next came the restraining order documentation. Margaret opened a new file and began systematically recording the confrontation, the threatening language, and the escalating pattern that had culminated in actual intimidation. She said the snake incident was particularly concerning, and that using live animals to frighten elderly parents shows planning and malice that courts take seriously. I asked her how long the process would take. She said the will modifications could be finalized within the week and the restraining order could be filed that day. Once it was granted, any contact from Samantha or Peter would become a legal matter rather than a family dispute. I felt something release in my chest, a tension I had been carrying for months. The weight of being perpetually available for Samantha's crisis, of walking on eggshells to avoid triggering her threats, and of enabling destructive behavior was all ending. There was one more thing Margaret said. Based on what I had described, she recommended documenting everything for potential future legal action. I needed to keep records of any attempts to contact me, any violations, and any attempts to involve the grandchildren. She said she thought it would get worse before it got better. People who use manipulation and threats don't usually accept boundaries gracefully. When Samantha discovered she had been cut out of my will and served with a restraining order, her reaction might be significant. But that no longer frightened me. With legal protections in place, her anger would be directed at a system designed to handle such behavior, not at two elderly parents trying to enjoy their retirement. Margaret's assistant brought in the prepared documents. As I signed my name to each page, I felt the satisfying finality of decisions made and implemented. 30 years of financial enabling was officially ending. Our home would be legally protected from harassment. The restraining order should be approved by the end of the business day. Margaret said court officers would serve both Samantha and Peter by tomorrow morning. After that, any contact with me or Jessica would become a criminal matter. I stood to leave, shaking hands with the woman who had just helped me reclaim control of my own life. Outside her office windows, the city continued its normal rhythm. Margaret called my name just as I reached her door and said I had made the right choices and that my family's safety and security came first. I nodded, tucking the folder under my arm. Tomorrow morning, Samantha would discover that manipulation was no longer an option. Tonight, Jessica and I would sleep peacefully, knowing the law was finally on our side. 2 days passed in the most peaceful quiet I had experienced in years. Jessica and I fell back into the comfortable routines that had been constantly interrupted by Samantha's crisis. We had morning coffee without dreading phone calls, afternoon walks without checking for missed messages, and evening dinners without discussing the latest financial emergency. On Thursday afternoon, Margaret called to confirm what I had been anticipating. She said the documents were delivered at 2:15 that day, and both Samantha and Peter had been served with the restraining order and received copies of the will modifications. It was done. I thanked her and hung up, then sat quietly in my chair for several minutes. Outside our window, Mrs. Patterson was planting spring flowers in her garden, and the Hendersons' children were riding bicycles on the sidewalk. Normal suburban life continued its peaceful rhythm. Jessica came and sat beside me, taking my hand in hers. She asked if the papers had been delivered, and I confirmed that they were that afternoon and it was finished. We didn't need to discuss what Samantha's reaction might be, or whether she would try to find ways around the legal barriers Margaret had erected. The law was clear, the protections were comprehensive, and for the first time in 30 years, we were truly free from her manipulation. I thought about the daughter I had raised, the little girl who had drawn stick figure families and made breakfast in bed on special occasions. That child had grown into someone who sent live snakes to her father and threatened to weaponize his grandchildren against him. The transformation had been gradual enough that I had spent decades making excuses for increasingly unacceptable behavior. But the woman who had stood on my doorstep demanding money and making threats wasn't someone I needed to enable any longer. The legal documents had created the boundaries that love alone could never establish. She and Peter got what they wanted. I was no longer in their lives. The irony wasn't lost on me. Samantha had spent years threatening to cut off my access to Emma and Jake whenever I didn't comply with her financial demands. Now, through her own escalating behavior, she had ensured that separation permanently, while simultaneously losing any claim to the inheritance she had been so desperate to control. Emma and Jake would be provided for through their educational trust fund, managed by professionals who couldn't be manipulated or threatened. Their college expenses, tutoring, books, and legitimate educational needs were all secured without giving their parents access to resources they had proven incapable of managing responsibly. Jessica squeezed my hand. She asked if I thought Samantha understood what she had lost. I replied that she would, and that the restraining order meant any attempt to contact us would become a criminal matter. The will changes meant there was no inheritance to fight for, no financial incentive to maintain even hostile contact. She would have to find other people to manipulate. And if she violated the restraining order, then it would become the police department's problem, not ours. For 30 years, I had been Samantha's safety net, catching her every fall while she learned nothing from the experience. I had sold my classic car to pay her gambling debts. I had covered her rent when she claimed unexpected emergencies. I had written check after check, always believing that this time would be different. This crisis would be the last one. The snake had been her final communication with me. Everything she wanted to say about our relationship had been contained in that box, dangerous, venomous, and designed to frighten and intimidate. But instead of driving me back into compliance, it had driven me to Margaret's office and the legal protections I should have sought years earlier. As the sun set through our kitchen window, Jessica and I prepared dinner together with the easy cooperation of a couple who no longer carried the weight of constant family drama. No phone calls interrupted our conversation. No emergency texts demanded immediate financial rescue. No threats hung over our heads about access to our grandchildren. The quiet felt profound, like the silence after a long, exhausting storm had finally passed. Tonight, Jessica and I would sleep peacefully, knowing the law was finally on our side. Tomorrow, we would wake up in a house legally protected from harassment. Our retirement savings would remain intact, earning interest for our own security rather than being slowly drained by someone else's poor choices. Our marriage would continue without the constant stress of managing an adult child's manufactured crisis. I had reclaimed my role as a father who loved his daughter enough to refuse to enable her destruction of herself and others. Legal boundaries had replaced emotional manipulation. Professional consequences had replaced family guilt. The law had given me back my life.